30 men in a room, one wall-sized map, one finger tracing the route that an army will follow, and one corporal at the back who realizes in real time that the map in front of General George Patton will send those men toward a junction that is not where the paper says it is. This video is about that moment, about what it costs to speak when everyone else has decided that silence is safer, and about why one sentence from the lowest rank in the room changed the route of the Third Army. Picture the scene. Colonels, majors, lieutenant colonels around the table. They have campaigns behind them, medals, staff experience. Patton is talking through the plan with the speed and confidence you would expect. Information flows up in neat reports. Orders flow down in straight lines. The unwritten rule of the room is simple. Rank is the loudest thing here. A corporal is supposed to be invisible, present, but not heard. At the back wall stands Daniel Kovacs, 22 years old, attached to the G2 section, working with the map team, there because somebody needs to be, not because anyone expects him to open his mouth. While Patton talks, Kovacs is not listening for style. He is checking coordinates. He has seen this overlay before. He has done the calculation once. Something does not match. He does it again. The same result. The junction on the map is not where the real junction is. In that moment, he is not just reading a map. He is reading the room. He knows what these briefings are. This is not a seminar. This is not a discussion. This is a place where a general with ivory-handled pistols does not routinely invite correction from colonels, let alone from the lowest rank in the space. Around him are men who have seen the same segment of map and felt the same unease. They have done their own private math and decided that the rules of the room outweigh the error on the paper. Kovacs raises his hand. He says, "Sir, I think the map is wrong." Silence hits the room in that special way it does when someone has said something that cannot be taken back. Nobody moves. Colonels look at the table. Majors look at the floor. The adjutant closest to Patton in those 2 seconds is suddenly reconsidering his whole career. Every man in that room runs a fast inner calculation. What are we watching, and what is it going to cost? Here is the educational piece hidden inside this dramatic moment. In any hierarchy, there is a room culture that decides which truths are safe to say and which truths are dangerous. Accuracy becomes risky when it crosses rank. Silence begins to feel like loyalty, even when it is actually negligence. The map is wrong, but the rule of the space says, do not correct the general. The result is 30 silent men watching one corporal do the thing they chose not to do. Patton looks up from the map and across the room at Kovacs. He does not snap. He does not perform. He just looks, the way a commander looks at terrain, reading it. What happens in the next 60 seconds will decide whether Daniel Kovacs has just ended his career or prevented a column from driving down a road that does not exist. And nobody in that room, at that exact moment, knows which way it will go. If this kind of hidden decision interests you, stay with me. Because what Patton does next explains not only why the Third Army moved the way it did across France, but also why one small voice against 30 silent officers might be the most important thing that happened in that briefing room all week. On the surface, what was wrong with the map looked tiny. One junction in a French road network placed where it used to be, not where it actually was. The overlay Patton was using that morning drew a key crossroads on the northern edge of a town, based on data from before a major reconstruction in the mid-1930s. The real junction, after the work crews had finished, sat about 1.5 kilometers to the southwest. On paper, that is a small displacement. On the ground, for a mechanized column moving fast through unfamiliar terrain, that gap is the difference between arriving on time and arriving 3 hours late. Between a clean, coordinated advance and trucks and tanks stacking up on a road that does not connect where they were briefed it would. Between units meeting where they expect to meet and units waiting at a point that only exists on an old map sheet. Kovacs knew this because his life before the war was built on the friction between maps and reality. He had spent 2 years doing drafting and survey training, then months in the field for a civil engineering firm, standing in real terrain with a transit and a notebook, checking what the map claimed against what the ground actually said. When you live that work, you learn a simple rule. The line on the page is a statement. The ground is a different statement. Only one of them can be true at a time. So when he saw Patton's finger trace a route that depended on a junction drawn in the wrong place, he was not seeing an abstract flaw. He was seeing trucks and fuel and men being committed to a road plan that geometry could not support. He understood that a staff error here did not stay on the staff. It traveled with the column. It arrived with the units that trusted the overlay. Here is the educational point. In any complex operation, tiny map errors sit in the high-risk category. They look small in centimeters. They are huge in hours, fuel, and coordination. When a briefing room treats them as minor, it pushes real risk down the chain onto people who do not get to check the map again. Staff work is frontline work. The quality of what happens at the table decides whether the men on the road are dealing with bad luck or bad planning. A wrong road is not just an inconvenience. It is a bottleneck that steals momentum from an entire army. A misplaced bridge rating can strand armor on the wrong side of a river. A junction that exists only on an outdated overlay can turn a fast march into a stalled line of vehicles waiting for engineering teams that were never scheduled. None of that shows up on the battle map as, "We were 3 hours late because we trusted an old survey date." It shows up as, "We missed our window," and somebody writes, "enemy resistance" in the margin. Daniel Kovacs was the only person in that room who both saw the specific mismatch and decided that the cost of staying quiet was greater than the cost of speaking. That is the tension this story is about. Not just between old data and new roads, but between a culture that makes silence feel safe and the reality that, in planning, silence can be the most dangerous choice. Stay with that moment in the room. A corporal has just said, "Sir, I think the map is wrong." 30 men are watching to see whether that sentence will be punished or used. Patton looks at Kovacs for a long second, not like a man who has been interrupted, but like a commander reading new terrain. Then he says 2 words that reverse the direction of risk in that room. "Show me." Kovacs walks forward from the back wall to the map table. He passes colonels and majors who had seen the same segment of map and chosen silence. He stands next to Patton and points to the junction. He explains the reconstruction in the 1930s, the shift in the road network, the 1.5 kilometer displacement between where the overlay shows the crossroads and where it actually is on the ground. He does not make a speech. He says what is needed and stops. Patton listens, eyes on the map, not on the corporal. He checks the surrounding terrain features. He glances at the tiny notation in the corner of the overlay that shows the source date of the cartography. He runs his own fast mental check. Does this fit what he knows about French roads? About old data? About how far a junction could move in a reconstruction? Then he says to the room, without raising his voice, "He's right." No lecture, no performance, no public scolding of the officers who held their tongues. In the next few minutes, the overlay is corrected, the route is adjusted, the briefing moves on. The chain of decisions that would have sent a column toward a non-existent junction is quietly broken and rewired toward the real one. That is what leadership looks like when it values accurate information over comfortable hierarchy. The educational point here is sharp. Patton does not reward map knowledge as an abstract skill. Nap knowledge is a qualification. Plenty of men in that room could read the same overlay. What he marks with a new stripe is something rarer. The willingness to be right out loud in a room full of people who outrank you, at the exact moment when speaking feels personally dangerous and staying quiet pushes the cost onto someone else. The next morning, Kovacs is told he is now a sergeant. No ceremony, no grand explanation. The paperwork was signed the previous evening. His sergeant first class, Roy Ingle, delivers the news with that particular mixed expression of pride and unease that comes when a junior has just crossed an invisible line in the culture of the unit. Is this good? Is this dangerous? Is there really a difference? Kovacs's first question is not about pay or status. He asks whether the route on the operational overlay has been corrected. Ingle says it has. Kovacs nods and goes back to the maps. Same eyes. One more stripe. The Army will move on without ever counting the cost of the thing that did not happen, the delay that was avoided, the fuel that was not wasted, the vehicles that did not stack on a road that went nowhere. Here is the hook for you as a viewer. What Patton promoted that day was not defiance for its own sake. It was a specific kind of courage, the ability to put accuracy above deference when the two collide. In any system that sends people into risk, that instinct is not a luxury. It is a survival trait. And an army that punishes that instinct is an army that will, sooner or later, follow a confident briefing down a road that does not exist. Now zoom out from that briefing room and look at the pattern it reveals. An army built on deference has a reliability problem. When the only information that reaches a commanding general has already been filtered through the question, what does he want to hear? That general is no longer looking at a map of terrain. He is looking at a map of his own preferences. In that room, most of the officers understood the rules. The rule was simple. You do not correct Patton in front of his staff. You do not raise your hand from the back row if you are a corporal. You let rank speak and let rank decide. That rule keeps meetings orderly. It keeps careers safe. And if you follow it to the letter, it eventually sends a column down a road that does not exist. Here is the educational point for any organization, not just a wartime army. When deference becomes the default, accuracy has to fight for space. People begin to calibrate their reports not to reality, but to expectation. The map in the boss's head tilts away from the ground. The cost of that tilt is never paid in the briefing. It is paid out where the plan meets reality, in delays, in failures, in avoidable crises. Patton understood this better than many commanders of his era. He had seen what staffs of yes-men produced. He knew that a culture in which the man with the most rank is always assumed right will sooner or later drive a route through terrain that the map only imagines. His Third Army moved at the speed it did across France and into Germany, not because he loved risk, but because the planning underneath the speed was relentlessly checked against reality. So when a corporal spoke up in a room where 30 men had chosen not to, Patton recognized something he needed. He needed maps to be right. He needed people around him who would tell him when they were not. He did not need open rebellion. He needed precise, grounded correction at the exact point where a wrong line on paper would turn into a wrong turn on the road. Think about your own context for a moment. In a company, a family, a project team, who pays the price when a leader is surrounded by people who only say what feels safe? It is not usually the person who stayed quiet in the meeting. It is the people who go out and try to execute a plan built on outdated data, optimistic assumptions, or ignored warnings. The pattern is the same as in that French briefing room. Silence feels polite. The consequences do not. A yes-man culture is comfortable in the short term and dangerous in the long term. It avoids awkward moments at the table. It creates much larger awkward moments out on the road. The story of Daniel Kovacs is not just a World War II anecdote. It is a case study in how one small act of accurate speech in a space designed for deference can realign an entire chain of decisions back toward reality. And here is the hook that carries forward. If an army punishes that kind of accuracy, it will one day follow a confident briefing down a non-existent road. If it rewards it, quietly, with a stripe and a corrected overlay, it increases the odds that its columns will drive toward junctions that are actually there. That is as true for war rooms as it is for boardrooms. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you have to know who Daniel Kovacs was before he ever stood in that briefing room. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Old steel, river air, and a Hungarian father who had spent 20 years learning the weight of American steel in a mill in the Hazelwood neighborhood. A large, quiet man who had learned the hard way that a job can be taken from you, but knowledge in your head cannot. He put his oldest son through 2 years of drafting and survey coursework at a trade school on 2nd Avenue for exactly that reason. Kovacs learned to draw lines that matched reality, to read elevations, to understand that terrain is not an idea, but a set of facts. After that came 8 months of field survey work for a civil engineering firm. 8 months of standing in real fields and real streets, checking what maps said against what the ground said, and learning that those two statements are never equally true. By the time his draft notice arrived, he was the kind of man who looked at a map and saw what was actually there, not what someone hoped was there. He had a younger brother still in school. He had a girl named Helen who worked at a department store downtown and wrote him letters about things that were not the war, which was exactly what he needed. He had bought a ring from a soldier who needed cash and kept it in a small tin, planning a specific question for after, when certification would be finished and maybe a job with the county engineering department would appear. All of that comes with him into that room. When he hears Patton brief from a flawed overlay, he is not a random corporal with a feeling. He is a trained surveyor, seeing a mismatch between data and ground that his whole working life has taught him to catch. His question, "Sir, I think the map is wrong," is not about ego. It is about the core discipline he carries. Only one of these two statements can be true, and the cost of choosing the wrong one will not be paid at the table. So when his Sergeant First Class, Roy Engel, tells him the next morning that he is now a sergeant, Kovacs' first reaction is not pride or fear. His first question is whether the route was corrected on the operational overlay. Engel says it has been. Kovacs nods and goes back to the maps. Same hands, same eyes. One more stripe. The Third Army moves forward fast, as it always does, and the room they left behind resets with new overlays. Here is the educational hook that closes this story. Whether that correction saved hours, fuel, or lives, you cannot calculate because you cannot count the cost of things that did not happen. You can only say that a column which was going to drive toward a junction that was not where the map said it was, drove instead toward the junction that was. And that shift happened because one man, at the exact moment when silence felt safer, chose to be accurate out loud. So the question for you watching this is simple and uncomfortable. In your own systems, your team, your company, your community, do you reward the person who breaks rank to keep the map honest, or do you punish them to protect deference? Because an army or a business that promotes deference and punishes accuracy will one day follow a confident leader down a road that does not go where the map says it does. And an army that quietly puts a stripe on the man who tells it what it needs to hear has a better chance of reaching the junctions that actually exist. Let's bring this all the way to you. In that Third Army briefing room, one corporal put a hand up and said the one sentence nobody else was willing to say. "Sir, I think the map is wrong. 30 officers chose silence. One man chose accuracy. Patton listened, checked, corrected the route, and quietly promoted the man who had been right out loud at the exact moment when speaking felt personally dangerous, and staying quiet would have pushed the cost onto someone else. The educational core of this story is not about World War II trivia. It is about how any system treats truth when truth cuts across rank. Map errors in staff briefings are not abstract details. They are decisions about time, fuel, and people dressed up as lines on paper. When a culture makes silence feel like loyalty and accuracy feel like risk, the maps that leaders use slowly drift away from reality. The distance between plan and terrain grows, one unchecked detail at a time. Patton's choice tells you something important. He did not reward defiance for its own sake. He rewarded grounded correction that protected the men who would have had to live with a wrong route. He needed maps that matched ground more than he needed a room in which nobody ever contradicted him. That instinct helped the Third Army move at the speed it did. It is the same instinct that any healthy organization needs if it wants to avoid driving itself confidently into dead ends. So ask yourself, in your own life, who gets the stripe? The person who makes things sound good, or the person who keeps the map honest? Do you make it easier for people around you to tell you when your overlay is wrong, or harder? Because the cost of punishing that kind of honesty is almost always paid somewhere else, by someone who was not in the room when the decision was made. Daniel Kovacs went back to his maps with one more stripe and the same pair of eyes. He did not become a hero in headlines. He became what he already was, with slightly more authority. The kind of man who looks at a plan and asks quietly, "Is this actually true?" That question is the real promotion. It is the thing you can choose to carry into your own decisions, even if nobody ever puts a stripe on your sleeve for it.